On Tuesday, July 7, 2026, inside London's High Court, a judge brought down the curtain on one of the most public legal campaigns any modern royal has ever waged against the press. Prince Harry's long fight against the publisher of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday ended that morning, and it ended badly. Every single claim he brought was thrown out. Not a partial defeat, not a split decision, a total loss. To understand how significant that was, you have to go back to where this case started. Back in 2022, Harry joined a group of high-profile figures who believed they had all been targeted by the same newspaper group using unlawful methods to dig up private information about their lives. He wasn't alone in this fight. Standing alongside him were the singer Elton John and his husband David Furnish, the actors Elizabeth Hurley and Sadie Frost, the anti-racism campaigner Doreen Lawrence, and the former politician Sir Simon Hughes. 7 claimants in total, all convinced the same publisher had crossed the same lines. The scale of what they were alleging was enormous. Together, they presented the court with 55 separate newspaper articles published between 1997 and 2015, plus 3 additional incidents that never even made it into print but were still, they said, evidence of the same pattern. All told, their lawyers put forward roughly 97 individual allegations: phone hacking, landline tapping, bugs allegedly hidden inside cars and homes, bank records and phone bills obtained through deception, and one of the more serious claims, corrupt payments made to police officers in exchange for information. The newspaper group denied every bit of it from the very first day. The trial itself ran for 11 weeks, and it became something far bigger than a courtroom procedure. It became a public reckoning, decades in the making. In January, Harry took the witness stand. That in itself was historic. He became the first senior member of the British royal family to testify in a UK courtroom in over 100 years. He told the judge that his life had been treated as a commodity since he was a teenager, that the coverage of his private life had never stopped, and that it had made his wife Meghan's life, in his words, an absolute misery. He described the experience of being hunted by these newspapers as something closer to a recurring trauma than an inconvenience. He said he had never accepted that his existence was open season for the tabloids to profit from. Much of his testimony returned again and again to his relationship with Chelsea Davy, a relationship he had in his 20s, which he said the paper exploited by accessing private communications between him and the people close to him. But the defense had its own story to tell, and it was not flattering to the prince. When lawyers for the newspaper suggested that the real source of leaks about his private life might have been his own social circle, friends, exes, people close to him who talked, Harry firmly rejected the idea. When they showed the court evidence that royal communications officials had, at points, dealt directly and routinely with journalists at the paper, including exchanges involving a royal correspondent and information about one of his former girlfriends, Harry maintained that those channels only ever existed for matters that affected the institution as a whole, never his personal life. The newspaper's legal team called a formidable lineup of witnesses to push back. The paper's editor from 1992 to 2018, a former editor of the Mail on Sunday, a longtime royal editor, a crime editor, a veteran royal correspondent. Testimony from several of them painted a very different portrait of a young Harry than the one presented by his own legal team, a young man who had, at various points, actually socialized with the same journalists he would later accuse of criminal conduct. Someone who attended their parties, who fed them information through palace channels when it suited him, and who, only later when it no longer suited him, turned around and sued. The case also surfaced an uncomfortable family detail along the way. According to legal filings connected to the trial, Harry has said that his own father, King Charles, opposed this entire campaign of litigation from the start, a claim that lines up with something Harry had already admitted publicly in a television documentary, that his war against the tabloids had become tangled up with, and in some ways become a symbol of, the broader rift between him and the rest of his family. Separately, the court threw out a claim raised during the trial that a rival newspaper group had struck some kind of secret deal with Buckingham Palace to prevent royals from bringing lawsuits like this one in the first place. When the judgment finally came down, it was blunt. The judge found that although the claimants clearly suspected journalists had used unlawful methods to gather information about them, suspicion was not the same as proof, and proof was what the law required. The court specifically rejected the idea that just because a piece of information was private, and just because the newspaper couldn't offer a tidy explanation for exactly how it got that information, the article must therefore have been sourced illegally. That leap, the judge said, wasn't one the court was prepared to make on the claimant's behalf. The newspaper group didn't hold back in its response. A spokesperson called the ruling an overwhelming victory, not just for the paper but for a free press generally, and described it as a magnificent vindication of their journalism. They dismissed the more dramatic allegations, the bugs in cars and homes, the illegally accessed bank accounts, as lurid, and said no credible evidence had ever actually been presented to support them. And they made clear the fight over money wasn't finished. The company said this case alone had cost them more than £50 million in legal fees, and they intend to go after the claimants to recover it. Harry's own reaction was just as sharp, in the opposite direction. In a joint statement with fellow claimant Doreen Lawrence, he called the verdict a complete and obvious whitewash, though, he added, not altogether unexpected. Separately, he was heard describing the outcome as totally unwarranted. He wasn't the only high-profile figure walking away with nothing. Elton John and David furnishes portion of the case, centered on 10 articles published between 2002 and 2015, including one from 2007 tied to a benefit concert connected to the singer's AIDS charity. There's a strange twist buried in that part of the story. 20 years ago, in 2006, this very same newspaper had actually paid Elton John libel damages after running a false story about one of his own fundraising events. 2 decades later, facing the same publisher in the same courtroom, the outcome went the other way entirely. Doreen Lawrence, the mother of murdered teenager Stephen Lawrence, and by now a long-serving member of the House of Lords, saw her claim dismissed right alongside everyone else's. So did the claims brought by Elizabeth Hurley, Sadie Frost, and Simon Hughes. Every single claimant, every single count, rejected. He wasn't the only high-profile figure walking away with nothing. Elton John and David furnishes portion of the case, centered on 10 articles published between 2002 and 2015, including one from 2007 tied to a benefit concert connected to the singer's AIDS charity. There's a strange twist buried in that part of the story. 20 years ago, in 2006, this very same newspaper had actually paid Elton John libel damages after running a false story about one of his own fundraising events. 2 decades later, facing the same publisher in the same courtroom, the outcome went the other way entirely. Doreen Lawrence, the mother of murdered teenager Stephen Lawrence, and by now a long-serving member of the House of Lords, saw her claim dismissed right alongside everyone else's, despite decades of public standing built on holding institutions accountable for exactly the kind of concealment and cover-up she and her fellow claimants alleged here. So did the claims brought by Elizabeth Hurley, Sadie Frost, and Simon Hughes. Every single claimant, every single count, rejected. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because the uniformity of the outcome is really what made it land so hard. This wasn't a case where 1 or 2 claimants had weaker evidence than the rest and got weeded out along the way. All 7 of them, with different lawyers pursuing different angles across different decades of alleged wrongdoing, ended up in exactly the same place. For a legal campaign built on the idea that there was a pattern, a systemic culture of unlawful behavior running through an entire newsroom for the better part of 2 decades. A unanimous defeat like that does more damage to the underlying narrative than a split verdict ever could have. It wasn't just that Harry lost. It was that the entire coalition lost together, on every single count they brought before the court. Now, to really understand why a case like this could even exist, you have to rewind further back to 2011, to the scandal that started all of it. That year, it came out that a private investigator working for a different tabloid, the now-defunct News of the World, had hacked into the voicemail of a murdered schoolgirl named Millie Dowler. The public reaction was so intense that the newspaper, which had been running for over 160 years, was shut down within days. It triggered a massive government inquiry that spent more than a year hearing testimony from hundreds of witnesses, editors, police officials, even multiple current and former prime ministers. And it concluded that the culture inside parts of the British tabloid press had, in its own words, been outrageous. That inquiry, and everything legal that followed it over the next decade and a half, is really the direct ancestor of the case Harry just lost. The inquiry itself heard from hundreds of witnesses over roughly a year of public hearings, editors, police officials, media executives, and several current and former prime ministers among them, before publishing its final findings toward the end of 2012. It recommended that the press be regulated by a new, genuinely independent body, free of political and commercial influence. What actually emerged from that recommendation, in practice, fell well short of what the inquiry itself had envisioned, and a planned second phase of the investigation, meant to dig into the relationship between journalists and police more directly, was quietly shelved years later before it ever really got underway. In the meantime, the civil lawsuits kept coming, publisher by publisher, year after year. A different newspaper group, the one behind the Mirror, was found in earlier litigation to have kept using private investigators for illegal information gathering for years after publicly claiming they'd stopped, with payments to investigators reportedly continuing right up until 2011, even while the government inquiry was actively sitting and hearing evidence. That pattern, scandal, denial, and then a slow legal unraveling years later, is a big part of why Harry framed his own fight the way he did. Not as personal revenge, but as a matter of public accountability. And it's probably why, for years, he seemed genuinely confident he could force the same kind of reckoning out of this newspaper group that had already happened, at least partially, elsewhere. This week's result suggests that confidence didn't pan out, at least not here. In the earlier case against the Mirror, the judge actually found real evidence, concluded that phone hacking there had been widespread and habitual for years. This time, against this particular publisher, no equivalent finding ever came. Just understandable suspicion, and a court that said understandable suspicion isn't enough to win. Because here's the thing, this wasn't Harry's first fight with the tabloids, and it wasn't his first outcome either. Back in December 2023, he actually won, at least partially, in a separate case against Mirror Group newspapers. A judge ruled that phone hacking there had indeed been widespread and habitual for years, with senior executives fully aware of it and actively working to cover it up. Of the 33 articles Harry brought to that trial as evidence, the judge found 15 of them were the direct product of hacked voicemails. His phone, the judge concluded, had probably been hacked to some real extent. He walked away from that case with roughly £140,000 in damages, and the following year, the same publisher paid him several $100,000 more to settle everything else. That earlier case produced one of the more memorable moments of his entire legal saga. After winning, Harry said the ruling proved that Mirror Group's board members, its legal department, senior executives and editors, including one editor in particular, a man who has spent years as one of Harry's loudest public critics, all knew about the illegal activity or were directly involved in it. That editor pushed back hard, insisting he had no knowledge of any unlawful news gathering happening on his watch, and pointing out that the judgment only tied a single article from his entire 9 years as editor to any kind of unlawful sourcing. Harry has also settled, separately, with the publisher of The Sun, receiving what was described as substantial damages, along with a public apology for the tactics used against him. And in an earlier, unrelated legal action, he had actually sued this same Daily Mail publisher for libel back in 2022 over an article connected to his dispute with the UK government about his security arrangements, a claim he eventually withdrew after losing the underlying case about his security. So this newest verdict isn't really a standalone event. It's the latest chapter, maybe the final one, in a legal saga that's run for years, with real wins, real settlements, and now, this time, a complete loss. None of this exists separately from the rest of Harry's public life over the past several years, either. He has said publicly, more than once, that he believes press harassment played a role in his mother's death in 1997, when the car she was in crashed while fleeing photographers in Paris. He's accused parts of the British press of racism and bullying directed at his wife, and he's pointed to that treatment as one of the reasons he and Meghan chose to step back from royal life and move to the United States in 2020. Since then, there's been a memoir, a documentary series, and a string of interviews that have kept the rift between him and the rest of his family very much in the public eye. This particular ruling landed during a rare trip he made back to the UK, a visit that had already stirred up plenty of speculation before he even landed, about whether Meghan and their 2 children would travel with him. In the end, they didn't. The trip also came with its own separate tension, a public back and forth with Buckingham Palace over what kind of security he and his family would actually be given while on British soil. And even with this case now closed, his legal troubles haven't fully wound down. Back in March of this year, a charity he co-founded nearly 2 decades ago sued him for defamation. The charity, built to support young people affected by HIV and AIDS in southern Africa, had been a source of real pride for him, founded in memory of his mother, alongside a friend from Lesotho. But things fell apart after a bitter dispute with the charity's board chair. He'd stepped down as patron the year before, following accusations from her that he had engaged in a pattern of bullying and harassment, and that he'd tried to turn the organization into something closer to a publicity vehicle for his wife. An investigation into those allegations, conducted over several months, ultimately found no evidence of the widespread bullying or harassment she had described. But it did find real governance problems on both sides, and it criticized everyone involved for letting what should have been an internal dispute spill out into public view instead. That case is still ongoing, still unresolved, playing out on a completely separate track from everything that happened this week. The charity itself carries his mother's memory in its very name. It means forget-me-not in the local language of Lesotho, and for close to 20 years it had quietly funded programs supporting children living with HIV and AIDS, work that had nothing to do with headlines or courtrooms. Watching that same organization turn around and take him to court over defamation, rather than simply parting ways privately the way so many charity disputes eventually do, added a strange, almost personal sting to a year that had already been dominated by his fight with the Mail. His own team has argued it's extraordinary that money meant for charitable work is now being spent suing the very people who built the organization in the first place. Money, they say, that should be going to the communities it was created to help instead. Put all of it together, and what you get is a legal record that's genuinely mixed. A partial win and a payout against one publisher, a quiet settlement with another, a withdrawn libel case tied to his security dispute, and now a comprehensive, total loss in the case that was supposed to be the final word, the one he testified about under oath, the one he tied most directly and most publicly to his mother's death and to everything that fractured between him and his family. There's also a financial reckoning still to come, with the newspaper group putting its own legal costs above £50 million and clearly intending to chase the claimants for that money. Harry and his 6 co-claimants could be looking at a combined bill running into the tens of millions. on top of whatever they already spent funding their own side of an 11-week trial. How exactly that cost gets split between 7 different claimants, and whether any of them push back on the amount being demanded, will likely play out in a separate hearing months from now, long after this week's headlines have faded. For the newspaper, this feels like more than just one case closed. It effectively puts an end to the last major unresolved hacking-related claim against any of Britain's 3 biggest tabloid groups, following what had already happened with the Mirror and with the Sun's publisher. Whether that really marks the end of this entire era of litigation against the British press, or whether new evidence and new claimants eventually surface the way they kept surfacing for 15 years after the original scandal broke, is still an open question. What's certain, at least for now, is this: the one fight Harry chose to make his last stand, the fight he stood up in court and swore an oath over, the fight he connected most directly to his mother's death and to the collapse of his relationship with his own family, didn't end in vindication. It ended with a judge telling him that however real his suspicion felt, it was never enough. There's something almost symmetrical about how this all played out if you step back far enough. He began this campaign years ago with a genuine win, real evidence, a judge who found actual wrongdoing, a settlement that felt, at the time, like the first crack in a wall that had stood for decades. He is ending it, at least for now, with the opposite. Not evidence rejected on a technicality, not a narrow loss decided by some procedural quirk, but a judge looking at everything both sides had to offer and concluding, plainly, that the case simply hadn't been proven. For a man who has spent years insisting this fight was about accountability rather than grievance, that distinction between a case that fails on the facts and one that fails on a technicality is likely to matter more to him, in the long run, than the size of the legal bill now sitting on his desk. And whatever comes next, whether it's the costs hearing still to be argued out, or the Centibale case still working its way through a different courtroom entirely, the pattern of the last several years suggests one thing clearly: the courtroom has become as much a fixture of Harry's public life as anything else that happens on a stage or in front of a camera. Win or lose, it doesn't appear to be a chapter that's actually finished, no matter how many times it's been described as the last one.